For those of us living in California, fire season can sometimes feel to be year-round. Even if you don't live near an area that is threatened by wildfires, the effects of wildfire smoke are felt throughout the entire state. Because of this, CalOSHA issued an emergency regulation in 2019 to protect workers from increased exposure to wildfire smoke through a combination of training, communication, and methods to reduce exposure at the worksite. This video will explain CalOSHA's emergency regulation on protection from wildfire smoke, the necessary steps for employers to integrate the requirements into their safety program, and help meet the training requirements of the regulation. First, let's understand what we mean by wildfire smoke and how it impacts workers. Although it may feel and smell like a typical campfire, wildfires significantly increase the number of particles that remain suspended in the air, as well as other harmful chemicals, depending on what is burning. This can create an exposure hazard to workers. Because these particles are an irritant, they may trigger serious or even fatal health effects. Asthma is probably the most common effect, but prolonged exposure can lead to reduced lung function, bronchitis, and even heart failure. There are certain factors, such as pre-existing lung and heart conditions, or age, that may increase the severity of health effects. There is a method to measure the amount of these pollutants and irritants in the air. When we talk about the particulates from smoke suspended in the air, we refer to a measurement called PM 2.5. PM stands for particulate matter, and the 2.5 represents the size of particulate in microns. To give you an idea of how big 2.5 microns is, a strand of your hair is between 50 and 70 microns in diameter, so you wouldn't be able to see a particle 2.5 microns wide with the naked eye. If the pollutant we're worried about from wildfire smoke is particulate matter less than 2.5 microns in size, then we need to know how many of these pollutants are floating around in the air at one time to understand how dangerous the exposure is. For CalOSHA's wildfire smoke regulation, 55.5 micrograms of PM 2.5 in a cubic meter is a threshold to trigger the protection requirements of the regulation. You can measure that with the appropriate instruments, but most of us don't have these devices laying around. There's a lot to understand there, so here's an example to demonstrate what that means. This box next to me represents 1 cubic meter. And this single grain of sugar is about 60 micrograms. Now to get this single grain of sugar into the size of PM 2.5, which is about 2.5 microns, I would have to cut it up into 4,000 pieces. Now throwing that into this cubic meter represents the amount of PM 2.5 in the air required for the air quality index to exceed 151. CalOSHA tried to give us an easier method to know if we have enough PM 2.5 floating around to trigger the regulation. The Air Quality Index, or AQI, is what many of us are used to seeing on weather reports in California to tell us how healthy the air is by giving us a number and a category. For PM 2.5, an air quality index rating of 151 or higher is the same as the 55.5 micrograms per cubic meter we talked about earlier. That way, you don't need to do any measurements on your own. You just have to watch out for the forecast, or use one of the websites we linked in the description below to get the reading for your area. Here's an example of one of those forecasts. Remember, there's 2 things we're looking for. First, is the primary pollutant PM 2.5. There are other pollutants that could be the primary pollutant for that day, so we're just focusing on PM 2.5 for this regulation. Second, what is the air quality index number? If it is 151 or higher, then we need to take the steps to try to reduce the exposure for our employees. Who are the employers who need to apply the wildfire smoke protection regulation to? The short answer is everyone, unless they fall under one of these 5 exceptions. Employees working in enclosed buildings or structures in which the air is filtered by a mechanical ventilation system, and the employer ensures that windows, doors, bays, and other openings are kept closed to minimize contamination. Employees working in enclosed vehicles in which the air is filtered by a cabin air filter, and the employer ensures all openings are kept closed. The employer demonstrates that the concentration of PM 2.5 in the air does not exceed a concentration that corresponds to your current AQI of 151 or greater by measuring PM 2.5 levels at the worksite. This goes back to the 55.5 micrograms of PM 2.5 in a cubic meter measurement we talked about earlier. Employees are exposed to a current AQI for PM 2.5 of 151 or greater for a total of 1 hour or less during a shift, or firefighters engaged in wildland firefighting. So what are your responsibilities as an employer? First, update your safety management system or your injury and illness prevention program to address these requirements. This will ensure the practices are sustained and effective. It also helps you demonstrate your efforts for agencies and clients who require these controls to be in place at your worksite. Second, you need to monitor the forecast to determine if PM 2.5 is a primary pollutant and know if the AQI is going to be 151 or higher. You are probably already monitoring the temperature for your heat illness prevention plan, so including these readings in your forecast should be fairly easy. Third, you need to have a system in place to communicate wildfire smoke hazards and mitigations for your employees. We created a tailgate safety one-pager to help with that communication. You can find the link in the description below. When the air quality forecast triggers a regulation, you can use it to remind your crews of that hazard and decide on the steps you'll take to reduce their exposure. This communication should also include encouraging employees to speak up if they feel they're being affected by wildfire smoke, and without fear of punishment. It's in your best interest as an employer to know early if your workers are feeling the effects of wildfire smoke, so you can take action while the treatment impact is low. Which brings us to the actual controls required by the Wildfire Smoke Protection Regulation. If PM 2.5 is a primary pollutant and the AQI is 151 or higher, then you must reduce exposure in one of the following ways. If possible, provide an enclosed location with filtered air that reduces the exposure to below the threshold of 151 AQI. You can also adjust work schedules and tasks with lower intensities to limit the amount of exposure if workers must be outside. If the exposure cannot be lowered to an AQI of 150 or lower, then NIOSH-approved particulate respirators must be provided to employees. Fortunately, an N95 mask will meet the requirements, but surgical masks, bandanas, and other face coverings like those used for COVID do not meet the requirements for wildfire smoke protection. Also, the use of a particulate respirator is voluntary for employees when the AQI is below 500, so it doesn't trigger other requirements for establishing a respirator protection program and medical surveillance. And for those of us with beards, employees do not have to shave when respirator use is voluntary. If the AQI for PM 2.5 exceeds 500, then particulate respirators are required for employees. Employees who use particulate respirators, whether voluntary or required, must be trained on the proper use and maintenance. The best practice is to use the manufacturer's instructions for this part of the training, since they may vary slightly between makes and models. As with any other regulation or safe work practice that applies to your organization, your safety program should be updated to reflect the hazard, your company's specific procedures, inspections, training, and record-keeping requirements. Hopefully this training has helped your company understand the requirements and made it easier to meet the training component. If you would like assistance with integrating these requirements into your company's injury and illness prevention program, or need additional support for your IIPP, feel free to reach out to us at arthurandhansen.com. You can also find a link to our website and social media outlets in the description below. Thank you again from all of us at Arthur & Hansen.